Hello. So today's class, we're going to talk about a few different things, and I want to kind of set that up before we jump into it. So the first, we've started talking about social influence, which is just another form of persuasion. I'm going to start today's class talking about involvement, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about involvement, which we've talked about in I think 3 lectures at this point. So you should be pretty certain about involvement and what it is. And then I'm going to talk about the elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model describes attitude change via persuasive communication or messages. It's the most famous persuasive model that we have to kind of understanding model that we have to understanding how persuasion works when it comes to persuasive communications and messages. I'm then going to talk a bit about heuristics. Heuristics are somewhat different than cognitive biases. I'll explain what heuristics are and how they relate to biases and how they're different throughout the lecture, but that is what we'll talk about second. Third, we'll discuss resistance to persuasion, right? So, how do people resist persuasive strategies, whether it's persuasive communication or other types of persuasion? So, I have some slides on that. And then we'll get into innovation. And I have, I don't know, maybe 30 slides talking about innovation. I'll talk about adoption, product adoption. I'll talk about diffusion and the theory of diffusion. And then I'll end talking a bit about branding. And so let's just hop into it. So I'm going to bring us back to one more thing, and that's involvement. So how much do we process information? A lot of times the degree to which we process information is incumbent or is related to the personal relevance that stimuli holds for you, right? When we talk about involvement, you can just substitute the words personal relevance, right? So there are certain things that are high involvement, meaning that the stimuli is very important to the consumer. And so then, because it's important to the consumer, they engage in moderate to extensive information processing. So when they see it, they attend to it, they comprehend it, they place it in their memory, they retrieve it later, right? And this is a moderate to extensive process, right? On the other hand, there is certain information that would be low involvement. So the stimuli holds very little relevance, holds very little perceived risk, and it results in limited information processing. So I'll give you an example. My BFF is pregnant. I'll be honest, I don't really care much about pregnancy. So in general, anything about pregnancy, to me, I don't really pay much attention to because it's not personally relevant to me. I'm very low involvement on the subject. But now that she's pregnant and she's talking to me about being pregnant like all the time, I tend to pay more attention to pregnancy related information, right? Even to the point where, although I'm not a huge fan of celebrities, I have been reading more articles about Meghan Markle. I'm not going to lie though, I feel terrible being honest about this. I do spend, like, when I'm reading these articles, I do spend some time looking at her clothes. I mean, she's a beautiful woman. She wears beautiful clothing. You just can't beat it. But I would say that that's moved to kind of a more moderate to high involvement level of stimuli for me. Whereas 4 months ago, when my friend wasn't pregnant, care less, right? I could care less. So I like to talk about preferences because there is a really, I would say, entrenched, very firm model that marketers and psychologists and consumer psychologists use when we're talking about message related persuasion. How do we change people's attitudes? How do we persuade them to do what we want? And so this model is called the elaboration likelihood model. Will you attend to information and then will you elaborate on that information? And the way the model works is pretty simple. I know it looks complicated. It's not. Let me just kind of talk about it. So on the left-hand side, you see this black box that says persuasive communication. Well, the first question is the person motivated to process the information? For a person to be motivated to process the information, we're going to assume that they have at least a moderate to high level of involvement or personal relevance to the information being given to them, right? This persuasive communication. So let's say they are motivated to process the information. So yes, do they have the ability to process the information, right? And that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe they don't understand. Maybe it's in a different language. Maybe their skill level isn't there. Maybe they can't really understand it because they have like 9 kids screaming in the background, something like this. But let's say they are able to process the information. According to the elaboration likelihood model, if they're motivated to process the information and they're able to process the information, then that information is going to go through what they call central route processing, right? And what that means is the person is more likely to elaborate on the information, meaning they're more likely to think about it more. They're actually more likely to pay attention to the central merits of the argument, so they're more likely to pay attention to what's being said. And they're more likely to integrate that information into what they already know, right? So I mentioned before I have a skin allergy, right? I have a skin allergy, which means that I can only use certain things on my skin. If I see a persuasive communication for, let's say, a new type of therapy for skin allergies, I'm probably going to be motivated to process it. Hopefully I'm going to be able to process it. Let's say I'm at my house on the computer and I'm going to go through central route processing, right? If I do that, then I'm more likely to think about what it is they're saying. I'm more likely to elaborate on what it is they're saying, right? Think about it. I'm more likely to pay attention to the merits of the arguments they're giving. And I'm more likely to integrate the information that they're providing into information I already know, right? So I know that one of the things that I can do and do is that I go and have this like light treatment, right? And so maybe one of the things that I do is I think to myself, oh, I wonder if I can use the light treatment and this new cream and if they will work together, right? I'm integrating information I already have. If the message is actually persuasive and I change my mind, then my attitude change is more enduring, meaning it lasts longer, it's more resistant to change, and it's more likely to predict behavior, right? On the other hand, let's say I see some level or hear some level of persuasive communication and I'm not motivated to process it. Or let's say I am motivated to process it, but I'm not able to process it. Let's say I see it on my cell phone, but then I suddenly lose Wi-Fi, right? So I'm not motivated to process it, or I'm not able to process it, excuse me. If that's the case, then you go through peripheral route processing. What happens is you have less elaboration. You don't really pay attention to what's being said. You rely on cues. So you rely on things like, is the person giving the message attractive? What is the cost of the product? This kind of thing. And if my attitude does change based on the communication, it's more temporary. It's more susceptible to change. So it's not resistant at all. And it's usually not really predictive of behavior. So I see this persuasive communication. I'll give you an example. Let's say I see a persuasive communication for perfume, right? I don't use perfume. I don't like it. There's a potentially persuasive communication. I'm not really motivated to process it. I don't wear perfume. It would go through the peripheral route processing for me. I wouldn't elaborate on it. I wouldn't think about this perfume for a long time. I would rely on cues like what's the actress or model or whoever that's in that. Do I like the ad? Stuff like this. If I change my mind and go, hey, I should try this product. It seems like it's really nice. Chances are I'll be thinking about that for like 20 minutes. When a new commercial comes on and says don't wear perfume, I'll probably just go ahead and say, I didn't like that perfume anyway. And again, I probably won't buy the perfume. So the elaboration likelihood model describes attitude change, right? So I try to walk you through that with 2 examples. If you go through the central route for processing, you have careful and thoughtful consideration of the merits of the information that's presented. We typically use central route processing when we are motivated and willing to pay attention. It's usually associated with logical and conscious thinking, and it doesn't have to, but it can lead to permanent change in your attitude. Peripheral route processing, though, happens when people are swayed by cues or they make simple inferences, right? So, oh, okay, Justin Bieber likes this, it must be good, that kind of thing, right? Justin Bieber is promoting this hair gel, he must use it, right? So you just make that inference. This kind of processing usually happens when we don't pay attention. But the change that may occur, like, ooh, I like this gel because Justin Bieber is using it, is temporary. And that's very important. So central route processing tends to be really effective when people find the message personally relevant and involving, right? So very personally relevant. When people are high in the need for cognition. So this tends to be a big deal. So research has shown that there are some people who are high in the need for cognition, and there are people who are low in need for cognition. I think, so anyway, if you're high in need for cognition, you are really interested in thinking, right? Like thinking is a high priority. I think they say something like 20% of the population is high in the need for cognition. So 80% are not. People are in a neutral or mildly negative mood. So that's when central route processing is also pretty effective. When you're in a neutral or mildly negative mood, you're more likely to attend to information, pay attention to information, so on and so forth. And the communicator speaks at a normal speed. This sounds nuts, but you would be surprised at how speech patterns affect consumers. So I had someone call me yesterday and leave a message, weirdest message I've ever heard in my life. It sounds just like this. Hello, how are you? I just stopped the message. I can't listen to that. I don't care what they're talking about. For example, if you're using central route processing, if you hear a political debate, you might decide to vote for a candidate because you found their views and their arguments convincing, right? Peripheral route is effective when people find a message irrelevant and non-involving. People are low in need for cognition. People are in a positive mood. So people tend to not pay any attention to what's going on when they're in a positive mood. Or the communicator speaks rapidly. So peripheral route would be effective if you really don't care that much about politics. You're just watching a political debate, and then you decide the candidate that you want to vote on based on kind of their voice or whether they went to the same university as you, maybe their height. I remember, I can't remember the political candidate off the top of my head, but people were just obsessed with the fact that I think it might have been Mitt Romney. He blinks a lot, right? So he's like, he blinks a lot or something like this. I can't remember. It might be Mitt Romney. Don't test me on that. So there were people who were persuaded to vote or not vote for this guy because they were paying attention to how much he blinked, which is odd because blinking is often very kind of, a biological thing that we do. But who am I to tell people how to choose their political candidates? Sorry, here's another demonstration of the elaboration likelihood model. You hear some kind of communication, you pay attention to it, you comprehend it, potentially. If it's low involvement processing, you rely on cues. You might have belief in behavior change. This might lead to attitude change. In the central route, high involvement processing, which leads to cognitive response, right? Cognition, beliefs. Belief and attitude change, which may lead to behavior change. If you're a marketer, you really like the central route because these are the kind of people who will have an attitude change and behavior change that sticks, right? They'll say, hey, I like Coke, and they'll only buy Coke or mainly buy Coke. On the other hand, if you're Coke, you don't want people going the peripheral route because they might be swayed by your commercial, but they're only going to be swayed for one day. So the next time they go to the grocery store, if it's tomorrow, they might buy a Coke. If it's 2 days from now or 3 days from now, they're back on whatever they were drinking before.
So, as I've mentioned before, I do experimental research. I love experimental research. And I specifically love reading the effects and kind of the manipulations, but neither here nor there. So, we can't say that the elaboration likelihood model works without testing it. And Petty et al., the authors who came up with the idea of came up with the idea of the ELM, definitely did test it. I'll look at two kind of results that they found. So essentially, they looked at consumers' level of agreement when the spokesperson, had low levels of expertise and high levels of expertise, right? Then they also looked at high or low levels of personal relevance, and that's why you see it in two different charts or graphs. The reason is because this would be considered a three-way interaction, and the best way to show people the data is really to split it up like this. You can show it in one graph, it just is real messy. So, anyway, when the product or idea or service has a high level of personal relevance, if the arguments are strong, it really doesn't matter if the spokesperson has low or high levels of expertise. You do see a jump, right? But the jump isn't that huge. I'm looking at the red line left hand side here. You don't see this huge jump. You see a much bigger jump, but I would still argue not statistically significant when you have weak arguments. So if it's high levels of personal relevance, we see a bigger jump in agreement when when the spokesperson has a high level of expertise, but it's not statistically significant, meaning it's there, but we don't know if that's actually what happens, right? We probably did not get a confidence level, a p-value that's lower than 0.05, meaning we can't say that we're roughly about 95% sure that we can trust the data here, right? So basically, again, let me go back. If it's strong arguments and it's highly personally relevant, then frankly, it doesn't really matter that much if it's low or high expertise. Similarly, if it's high personal relevance and you have weak arguments, the effect is not strong enough to say that a high expertise source is going to give you better results. Just the effects just aren't strong enough. On the other hand, if you look at something with low personal relevance, right? So the right hand side, for strong arguments, we see this huge jump in in personal relevance, where under low expertise, consumers really didn't trust the person, right? So you can start off there, whereas um, with high expertise, with low personal relevance, you see with strong arguments, you do see a bigger jump, and you see a big jump in kind of the level of influence, the level of agreement, right? On the other hand, if you look at a weak argument, right? So if it's low personal relevance, it's a weak argument, then high expertise is needed, right? You see that huge jump in values. That's huge. I hate to keep using that word, but I'm wishing my data looks like this. So ultimately, what I would argue that Petty et al. Show is that really, if it's low personal relevance, you are going to want to have stronger arguments if you have, if you really want agreement. And if you have weak arguments, then you need to use a high expertise source. Last but not least, last week I mentioned that we were going to start having articles that were in addition to the lecture. This week's article comes from Tormala and Rucker in 2015, and it is talking about how certainty transforms persuasion. It's only about 3 to 4 pages. I think it's a good HBR read. I hope you do too, and it will be on the test. So good luck. Okay, so I talked about the fact that
resistance to persuasion is something that I'm really interested in. I should start off by saying that attempts at persuasion often have a limited impact. That's one of the reasons that we study persuasion so much. We talk about it so much because we know that attempts to persuade are often not that effective. That's why we have the ads rolling over and over again. That's why we have marketing strategy, looking at price, looking at distribution, so on and so forth, because we know that these are persuasive techniques, and that we need to figure out ways to get people more persuaded. Frankly, one reason that people might not be persuaded, and I think this is important to talk about, is that they might not want to be influenced. Right? They are motivated to resist persuasion. So I'll give you an example. I hate ads, right? I hate ads. So I don't really watch a lot of regular TV because I don't want to see the ads. And I get kind of irate when I watch something like Netflix or Amazon Prime and they try to show me ads, even if it's for just their own content. So I find ads annoying, whether they're ads for TV shows on Netflix or Amazon Prime, or they're, common household good ads, right? So, or goods ads. So, for example, I don't want to see an ad about how effective Clorox bleach is, and I don't want to see an ad about how, great this movie is. Both of them to me are annoying, and I don't want to be influenced to watch those ads or watch those shows or buy that Clorox. So how do we resist persuasion? Well, one strategy that we use is avoidance. We have selective attention, right? We tune out um, information that contradicts our pre-existing attitudes. We do this all the time, right? We tend to seek information that goes with our existing attitudes and avoid information that doesn't. This is, you can think about this now in the election cycle and past the election cycle, frankly, when it comes to what television we watch, what news stations we watch. We know that conservatives tend to watch Fox News. We know that they tend to read uh, things like National Review. We also know that, more liberal consumers tend to watch MSNBC. I hate to say this because I don't actually believe this, but, more liberal consumers tend to watch or read the New York Times. I hate to say this because I actually, while I do think that there's a slight liberal bent of the New York Times, I think that a lot of the reporting there is fair. Now, the opinion pieces can be really liberal, but I think a lot of kind of the reporting is fair. We know because we've talked about it before that you can engage in selective exposure. So, controlling kind of what you're exposed to. Examples of that when you're watching TV, you're zipping, you're zapping, and you're muting. And then another avoidance tactic is to engage in what they call selective evaluation, where you like things that support your current attitudes and dislike things that contradict your current attitudes, right? So we see this happening all the time. I would argue we see this happening with boycotts. So, for example, um, when I can't remember the company. Oh, when Keurig came out and said something that favored liberals, we saw a lot of people post on social media where they were like throwing their Keurigs off the balconies in their homes or lighting them on fire or smashing them with, hammers and so on and so forth. And a lot of conservatives were gung ho about it. On the other hand, when people say, I'm going to boycott, Chick-fil-A because of their views on homosexuality or LGBTQ, we saw a lot of conservatives who were pretty pissed about it, right? So to me, that's an example of selective evaluation. I think it's a pretty good example, and I think we could find very similar examples when it comes to liberals who do the exact same thing. Everybody does this. Let me be clear. Everybody does this. It's just like cognitive biases. So the last time we met up, I think was last week, I talked about cognitive biases. And one of the things I try to make clear is that cognitive biases, everybody falls for them. It's not just kind of you did because you're, unintelligent or stupid. It's no. Intelligent people fall for cognitive biases. Remember, cognitive biases are a predictable pattern. Selective evaluation is often a predictable phenomena. I feel kind of crazy. I've been talking about this to this slide for a minute, and then I realized I didn't hit record. So, I'm on a whole different level right now. I'm just on a different level. So, another strategy that is used to resist persuasion are what they call contesting strategies. So, you can contest the content by counter arguing. So, you can say, I don't agree with that. This is stupid, so on and so forth. Um, Usually, counter arguments are activated when you think that the information that you're hearing is out of sync with your existing beliefs. And you notice those discrepancies, right? So, for example, I said that I believe that not cotton candy, excuse me, candy corn is old people candy. If I were to hear something on the news that says, it's the best candy ever, I would, take exception to that. I graduated from the University of Arkansas and the University of Missouri. When people talk trash about them on TV or online, I, take exception to that. People do this with political candidates. They do this with, amendments or ideas that they favor. This is something that we all do. Um, and frankly, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with counter arguing. Just like a lot of these strategies, what we should be doing is taking kind of what we believe and digging deep to make sure that there are reasons that we have this belief. This is actually kind of not to go off on a tangent, but I'm going to go off on a tangent. This is actually one of my biggest frustrations, right? So I went to a party with a friend a couple of years ago. I might have said this, and my friend said going to parties with me was ridiculous because when I have conversations with people, I often cite research or cite articles that I've read. Oh, I read this article in the Washington Post and it said this, or research says XYZ. And a lot of people are just talking to me with their opinions. And so sometimes when people have opinions, I don't know where we get them from, myself included. We just base our opinions on thin air. And then when we're hearing actual facts and logic, we don't take the time to kind of think about those things or research those things, which is what I really recommend. And so we stay stuck in our old opinions. This is highly problematic because in my mind, and I hope in your mind too, we are all um, evolutionarily programmed to grow, right? And if you don't kind of grow, and if you kind of just stay stuck where you are, what does that mean for yourself? What does that mean for the people who love you and who are around you? So, I'd like us to think about that we are kind of backing up our opinions with factual knowledge. And so we're not just spouting things that have no real basis or no real evidence. So anyway, back to contesting strategies. Another thing you can do is contest the source. We typically call this source derogation. So this happens when you kind of dismiss the credibility of the source or you question their expertise or their trustworthiness. So, one thing that we could do is that we can go ahead and call news fake news if we don't like it. We can say we know that they're completely lying because it's fake. We can say that the person who wrote it isn't a good author or is not a good journalist, so on and so forth. My mom, my mom used to say when we watched football together, which we did on Sundays, my mom would say, "Where did he, go and get his degree? Where did he learn how to play football? Kmart or where'd you get your driver's license? CVS, that kind of thing." So you can do things like this. This is also problematic, right? That we would kind of derogate the source without actually knowing their background and their credibility. We just assume. Another thing that we can do is defensive stereotyping, where we kind of avert the consequences of a threatening message by activating a negative stereotype about the sender. So we also see this quite a bit where people kind of activate a negative stereotype where they say, oh, you can't trust her because she's a woman, or you can't trust him because he's Latinx, or you can't trust them because they're black, or you can't trust them because they're overweight, whatever it is you want to say, you activate this negative stereotype. And so then you kind of derogate the source. So this is actually really interesting. If in my mind, I think this is a really interesting topic. You can also contest the strategies that are being used, right? So one of the things that people do is that people develop these theories and they develop these beliefs about how other entities are trying to influence you or how other entities are trying to persuade you. This is a part of the persuasion knowledge model that was interested in Frystad and I'm sorry, that was introduced by Frystad and Wright in 1994. And they talk about the fact that, people are constantly thinking that other people are trying to, other people, other organizations, government entities, policies, whatever, are trying to influence them, right? Um, we know from the literature that persuasion knowledge has been found to develop over time. So we tend to be more knowledgeable about the fact that companies are trying to persuade us, organizations are trying to persuade us, nonprofit organizations, the government is trying to persuade us, our friends and family are trying to persuade us. And we know that these things develop over time with age. They also develop over time with exposure to um, marketing messages, right? Many people know that advertisers use babies or puppies or models or, scantily clad women or food to appeal to our emotions. I say food because, that also can be a big deal. And we also know because several studies have told us that young people, and specifically young children, understand that there are persuasive tactics that marketers use, right? One thing that I want to say is that even though we might contest the strategies being used and say, hey, they're deliberately trying to persuade me to buy this. Hey, they're deliberately trying to persuade me to vote this way. Hey, they're deliberately trying to persuade me not to smoke. It isn't always ineffective, meaning sometimes we are actually persuaded even though we know that the entity, some kind of entity, is trying to persuade us. So you might see a commercial and go, they're trying to persuade me to do XYZ. Forget it, I'm doing it. I mean, think about it. How many people see an ad for, a new Taco Bell item and you go, oh, they're just trying to persuade me to buy it. But you know what? The next time I go to Taco Bell, I'm going to go ahead and get that. I'm going to go ahead and swoop that up. Or Macy's has an ad that says they're having their, biggest clearance sale ever, which, they have these kind of ads all the time. And you go, oh, they have these ads all the time. They're always trying to persuade me to do XYZ. I'm going to go ahead and go to Macy's this weekend. There are times when these strategies work. There are times when they don't. And I want to be very clear about that so that we kind of understand that just because we understand that companies or organizations or different entities are trying to persuade us doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't persuaded, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that we are persuaded. So I think this is really interesting, right? So when you look at strategies that companies use to persuade consumers, and you ask consumers how much they trust this type of advertising, and keep in mind that advertisers and marketers and researchers are aware that there is skepticism, and we do try to account for that in many of our studies. But I think this is fascinating. So when you trust completely these recommendations, 8% they don't trust much at all. I think this is hilarious. I wonder who these 8% are, where they're like, I don't trust these people around me. My sister gave me a recommendation. I don't trust her. I just find that hilarious. Um, a lot of people apparently don't trust text ads on mobile phones. If you look at those numbers, 29% trust somewhat or trust completely. 71% don't trust much at all. Also, I'd like to know who these people are that you get a text ad on your mobile phone and you go, oh, I trust this completely. That's weird to me. Online video ads. You see that a lot of people don't trust them. Ads in magazines, you see almost a 50-50%, uh, you know, split between trust and don't trust much at all, which is really good, right? So if you're a company and you're looking this over, you probably are going to want to use the advertising methods that people say they trust at least, 50%. And then you're going to try to figure out ways to boost the trust level of some of these other things. Not that you don't put ads on mobile phones, but you try to figure out why people don't trust them, and then you address that either within or without the ad, within the ad on the phone, or kind of in a different context, I should say.